A couple of days ago, I made a video about getting invited to a chess training session as a kid, and where the coach was Garry Kasparov, arguably the greatest player of all time. And Garry roasted me. He made fun of my poor organizational skills. I played chess like a maniac. I brought him a crumpled up piece of paper with a blitz game on it, and I didn't really seem like I was taking the training session seriously. Well, in that video, I said something about also getting kicked out of a chess camp when I was younger. And that's what this video is going to be all about. So first it's going to be story time, and then I'm going to share a game, just like always. When I was a kid, I was invited to a chess camp with Artur Yusupov. Artur Yusupov was ranked number 3 in the world between 1986 and 1992, behind Kasparov and Karpov. He was an exceptional chess talent, winning basically everything except the world championship. And he ran a chess camp with this organization in New Jersey, a couple weeks every summer. Now, I was the highest rated in the camp, or just about that, and I was a chaos. I mean, I was crazy during recess, and I would constantly tell kids the answers. I would interrupt Artur. I wouldn't listen. I would talk back. I made kids cry over, blitz games because I was so aggressive and talked so much trash. And one day, Artur told the organizer that it was either him or me. So I have that on my resume as well. I mean, you'd think that looking at some of these pictures, like, I'm an angel. I mean, I'm like the nicest kid ever. Like, look at me. I had such an illustrious childhood. I was so well behaved. Look at me. Look at me and all my trophies. No. And I figured for this video, I would actually take what's considered Artur's best game and show it to all of you. We can do an instructive video analysis, and I would have this little bit of story time. And one quick thing before we actually jump into the games. In that Kasparov video, I shared a game I played against a childhood friend who's now, in the corporate ranks and is successful and is enjoying chess as a hobby. And we reconnected on LinkedIn, actually, like yesterday, I think that was. So pretty funny how the world goes round. And he would remember a lot of these things because we were at that chess camp together. So hi, Max. If you ever see this video, hope you're doing well. And amazing memories we made together. All right, let's take a look at the game of Artur Yusupov versus Vasily Ivanchuk. This was played in the early 90s. Artur had the black pieces. At this point, Ivanchuk was the second highest rated player in the world. He peaked a few times in his career, but this game was incredible. So let's take a look. The game begins with the move c4, and Artur plays e5. This is very logical, straightforward, and standard. g3, d6, and what ends up happening is the players just get a King's Indian. In a really roundabout move order and way, the players get a King's Indian, and, white plays knight f3, knight f6, castles. Now, this can happen if white begins the game with d4 and c4, followed by knight c3. This can also happen like this. Players are so far keeping the tension in the center of the board, both guys not wanting to commit, and usually at this point, white will decide whether or not to lock the position, or keep it open and flexible and develop, with moves that don't actually commit the central pawns. So queen c2, exactly. Rook to e8. Now you are constantly threatening to push this pawn because you've supported it with the rook and your knight. Ivanchuk doesn't seem particularly phased. c6, another very common move. You can now bring the queen out in this direction. You also stop anything from coming over here. And in the long run, this bishop is kind of blocked a little bit on the diagonal. So you have b3, you have queen to e7, bishop to a3. And this is kind of a very logical move. Actually, at first glance, this looks pretty unpleasant to be playing with the black pieces here, but Yusupov has a plan. e4, knight to g5, and, well, now 4 pieces are attacking this, so black plays e3. Of course, that pawn is untouchable, because if you take it, it's a fork, and you die. Actually, you probably die even more painfully because I also have knight g4 and knight f2 coming. So that didn't happen, and instead Ivanchuk plays f4. Now, if anybody's curious whether you can en passant here, you can't, because to en passant, you would need the pawn adjacent. It would need to be right next to it. It can't be like this. It can't be diagonally in front. So f4, and this pawn now is just kind of standing there, and Ivanchuk's got a kind of an interesting space advantage in position. Knight to f8, very important move. You're not going to go forward, so first you come back, you open up the light squared bishop to go to f5, and then you will decide what to do on the king side. Ivanchuk plays b4. He's made his intentions very clear. He wants to attack on this side. So Yusupov plays bishop f5, attacking the queen. Ivanchuk uses the square that he just created. And now we have h6 and knight to g4. Well, you might as well transfer your knight in this way as well. This move opens up the queen, and you are now ready to go g5 because your queen covers that. With the knight there, the queen did not cover that. So Ivanchuk plays the move b5. Now here's the hardest thing about being an attacking player. Do you take, do you push, or do you ignore? Very difficult decision. If you push, you are giving up the d5 square. If you push this pawn, white goes to d5. You've granted white access here. This pawn is forever a target, and when I open it, I will have my rook in the game. So pushing doesn't make any sense, and that's how you have to think about it. If I push this pawn, I'll be opening up squares and files and diagonals for my opponent. If I take this pawn, the same thing applies. I lose control of d5. That's the important square. It's to negate the effect of this knight. And so for that reason, Artur plays g5, disregarding the b pawn entirely. We have bc6, bc6, and Ivanchuk makes this trade because now this pawn is a weakness. He has the b file, and maybe he will put it to good use. While Ivanchuk here does something absolutely fascinating. He plays the move knight e5. Under normal circumstances, that can just be captured, but because this pawn is pinned to the queen, you can't take this with the pawn. At the same time, you also have no interest in taking this with the knight or the bishop. If you take it with the bishop, you've weakened your king substantially, and if you take it with the knight, white goes f or d takes e5, and now has pressure on the one pawn that's pinned to your queen, not to mention that your pawns are not taking anything. The whole point of launching the pawns on this side of the board is to trade them and open up the lines to the enemy king, which is only protected by a bishop. I mean, all of white's pieces are in a rectangle on the queen side. So if you can open up the position, the bishop is going to be the only thing protecting the king. And so for that reason, you leave the knight exactly as it is and continue to take pawns. Yes, white has this pawn to capture, but that is something that you will calculate and now move your queen to g5. Very logical move. Queen here, and now all of this is under pressure. Ivanchuk takes the last pawn, and with this in mind, he now uses kind of like a, a little boomerang technique, although a boomerang comes back directly to you, so that's not accurate. He kind of brings his bishop here and now has vision of this side of the board. Okay, so Artur continues to get another piece into the attack. He's not making a committal decision just yet. He would actually love it if black played pawn takes f4, if white played pawn takes f4, excuse me, and he would be able to take, and not to mention just go here. I mean, there's no need to even take this. Now that this pawn left its square, again, we see this concept of freeing up the square on g3. Queen takes it, queen to h2, and queen f2 are devastating threats, and white is simply losing. Whoops. I just jumped ahead and spoiled a little bit of the game. Forget that you saw any of that, and we will continue the game from g takes f4. So knight takes c6, queen g5, bishop d6, and we have the move knight to g6. So knight d5. Ivanchuk brings the knights forward, looking for knight f6, looking for knight e7, looking for knight c7, and all of these pieces are now fighting for the f4 square as well. Very big decision now from Yusupov. He can jump in with the knight, he can jump in with this knight, sacrificing, looking for a knockout, he can take, he can push his other pawn, he can play queen h5 and threaten. What does he do? He goes for the simplest approach. You have a queen, you have a horse, you have a pawn, let's link them all up together and attack. Of course Ivanchuk plays h4. He does not play h3 attacking the knight, because then the knight would go here, attacking the rook, and now three pieces line up on this. And again, the more you push the pawns in front of your king, the more delicate they are going to become. So we get h4. The difference here is that if you want to make any progress, you now have to sacrifice. Well, you don't have to sacrifice, but Yusupov sacrifices. So he sacrifices on h4, and after gh4, queen takes h4, he has a very, very scary attack. Now, in this position, I'm not going to tell you the eval, and by that I mean I will. It's actually +9. But back then, there was no robust engine supercomputer that could refute all of this attack. In fact, what happens now if you plug this position into a computer is it gives you a really crazy evaluation, and then it slowly starts to dwindle a little bit and then finds a technique to defend here for white. But defending here for white is extremely impractical, which is why this game was voted as the best game between like 1966 and 1996. Literally the best game, the craziest game in 30 years. So knight comes to e7. It's a check, and the bishop on f5 is all but lost. So we have king to h8. Of course, we have knight takes f5, and now we have queen h2 and king f1. So we have a position where Ivanchuk is up 5 points of material, but meanwhile his king is getting absolutely swarmed, and it's very scary. It is not pleasant. It is very scary. These moves are coming in. Rook e6. Now his rook is going to join the attack, and once that happens and the knight moves out of the way, you're in serious trouble. But Ivanchuk finds a beautiful move. He finds a move that actually creates harmony on all sides of the board. The move, queen to b7. And it attacks the rook, it attacks the pawn, and in the future will attack the bishop. And all you have to do is move the knight, which will defend the bishop on the other side of the board. So we get rook to g6 anyway. And we have queen takes a8. Of course, after queen takes a8, the position is one where Ivanchuk has a 10-point material advantage. Yeah? And so, obviously, he is winning. Except he's not. And remember what I said earlier about engines? If you play rook g6 and let the engine think for about 15 seconds, it starts to tell you it's like +8, +9. And then once you put this position on the board, suddenly it starts to realize, wait a second, this attack is actually very scary. And black is basically winning. Black has an unstoppable threat that's kind of insane. So for example, let's say, you go here and you try to threaten mate on g8, right? Well, I don't need to move my knight, and I don't need to move my rook anymore. I just go queen h1 check. You take it, I go check, king e1, and rook g1 mate. And I think from a distance, the engine misses this queen sacrifice, gluing the king in. I mean, Ivanchuk is up 19 points of material, and yet he's getting mated here. So, the only move here, the only move that doesn't lose for white, queen g8 check. As if you have a knight on e7, but you sacrifice a full queen to check and win the rook. That is what you have to do. You have to check and win the rook. That is the only way you don't lose on the spot. And now, what is the count? Ivanchuk is still up 3 points of material, but his king, what about his king? So Ivanchuk takes another piece. But instead of recapturing, Yusupov plays the move knight to f2. Now the rook is hanging, and he's threatening to play knight h3, threatening queen g1 mate, and if bishop h3, that's mate and that's mate. Two mates. So, bishop takes f4. Ivanchuk's only move, once again, not to lose the game. Queen takes f4, this one we will take. Now the knight escapes and hits the queen. But the queen returns right back, ready to create the threat of knight to h3. Ivanchuk plays rook b1, but now knight h3 is coming. Actually, again, if you look at this with a machine, it doesn't even realize the power of black's attack until this happens. And it goes, oh, crap. And it's just over. Rook b7 check, king to h8, rook b8, sacrificing the rook, taking the horse, and yet it doesn't matter, because queen returns right back, and it's coming in, and mate is unstoppable. An absolutely insane game, which all the way back here, according to the machine, doesn't work. Literally, I'm looking at the eval right now, and it says plus 9.5. And if you start putting moves on the board, watch, it says plus 6, knight ce7. Not knight de7 as played in the game, but knight ce7. Okay? So maybe this is the way to go, because in the game we had this, king h8, knight f5, queen h2, and this rook move. So what is the difference between the two variations? If the knight went to e7 and the king went to h8, and this was taken, and all of the same stuff occurred, could there have been rook to e6? And if queen b7, could there have been this? The difference is that in one of these variations, the knight is on c6. One knight is on f5. And in this variation, there's a knight on d5. Queen a8, king h7, and it looks like after bishop takes f4, the key difference is the fact that the knight is on d5, and you are able to take on f4 with the bishop, which prevents this idea, because now the bishop covers the h2 square. Again, the difference in the game with the position is the fact that if we rewind and go through the game exactly as it occurred, notice the positioning of the knights. The wrong knight went to e7 for Ivanchuk, taking on f5. And the wrong knight cost him the ability to defend against this checkmating attack. That's all it came down to. And probably what he had missed from a distance is the fact that when queen b7 arrives, black can just go rook to g6, threatening queen h1 and this gorgeous idea. Artur Yusupov was known as a player who valued tremendous study, and there was a quote about him that said something like, he didn't just get things out of inspiration. He wouldn't just come to the board and let it come. He needed to study a position and study its ideas meticulously, which is probably why he was able to have an extremely robust training mechanism with Mark Dvoretsky and publish so many successful chess books. I've recommended his books to a variety of students that are anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000, and I've worked on some of them myself, looking at some of the endgame and test chapters just to see my calculation, my positional understanding, and so on. Well, that's the story. I made a former world number 3, one of the most elite players of all time and chess trainers of all time, kick me out of a chess camp and give an ultimatum to the organization that he had been hired by to, run this camp. And the funny epilogue to this story is that in 2015, I played in a chess tournament, and I actually saw Yusupov. He was playing in that chess tournament live, and I didn't know what to do. I wanted to apologize to him in person, actually. I was so embarrassed by what I had done, and I was really wondering if he had remembered me, because like 10 or 12 years had passed. But yeah, pretty amazing story, and well, there you have it. I'm glad that I matured. Maybe.